economic inequality should not give development aid to other countries. So we have a few reminders before we start the round. First, please be reminded of the POI mandatory. Secondly, for the audience, kindly put your voice at a minimum so we'll be able to hear debaters speak clearly. So judging this round will be the following. I'll be chairing this round. My name is Jake. With me as panelists are Kevin, Casey, Justin, Kelly, Rose, and Jason. So without further ado, to start this debate, I'd like to call on the Prime Minister.
Here. Here, here. Mamaya guys, kasi I hear this mom.
We think that in the status quo, countries like the United States, despite their immense economic inequalities, despite the fact that they are fraught with homelessness, and despite the fact that many American citizens, despite living supposedly in the land of plenty, live well below the poverty line despite their jobs, we think that these countries are still viewed as being heroes because they give development aid, because they give other countries. And we think this is something that's morally abhorrent and principally inconsistent. Why is this? Firstly, we believe that the obligation of every state is first and foremost to its own people. We're going to concede, to some extent, they also have an obligation to the world as a whole. But we think, ladies and gentlemen, that this particular obligation always comes after the obligation to its own people. That's why, for example, we don't give all our money to developing countries, even though they need it more. But furthermore, we also think that it's not as if these developed countries are going to do absolutely nothing for other countries in need. We're not talking, for example, about humanitarian aid. Obviously, if people are starving and dying, or if there's a major conflict and they need that aid right now, we think we do have a moral obligation to give it to them. But why exactly is development aid different? It doesn't necessarily function in the immediate needs of the people. In fact, it's something that operates in the long term. This development aid, for example, is used in economic stimulus packages to create infrastructure and etc. and etc. This tells us two things later. Firstly, that these are non-essential services that can be survived without, but secondly, that given that we are using this for economic stimulus, for infrastructure, and etc., these are things that function in economic inequality, in the capacity of individuals to economically empower themselves, which means that if we were to funnel those funds into our own people, we would be able to create those same economic stimuluses to reduce that particular inequality, right after this. We think, furthermore, that states with high levels of inequality, such as the Scandinavian states, can and do help developing countries in the status quo, so it's not as if we're leaving them completely in the dark after this, I promise. But we think we also have to remember that this aid, while it might sound like a good and a nice thing to do, necessarily comes at the cost of our own people. And we think, ladies and gentlemen, that the suffering of our own citizens is no less valuable than the suffering of citizens in far-flung countries simply because those countries are developing or etc. Obviously, if we give that money to somebody else, we can't use that for the needs of our own people, even if those needs are things that are immediate, such as, for example, homes or food for the homeless, such as, for example, healthcare services, or even, for example, economic stimulus that could, at the very least, bring a lot of those individuals who are living below the poverty line a little bit higher above it. We think that even in countries like America, we live in the land of plenty, and yet we have so many individuals who are homeless or live below the poverty line. We think that we do have the capacity to alleviate this, and given that, it's morally abhorrent to allow our own people to suffer, even as we continue to give development aid and even use it as a political tool to other individuals. This particular characterization also tells us why it's going to make it imperative for the state to actually use these funds to help individuals. Not only are individuals going to know that the state has more money to give them, but because development aid is used as political leverage, is used in maintaining the image and the influence of that particular country, we think that the loss of this particular capacity to maintain influence is something the state is fundamentally going to want to get back. And that means there's going to be more incentive for them to actually decrease that particular inequality so they can continue to gain back that particular political leverage. We think that leverage is something that's much more concrete, something that is much more compelling than simply a moral obligation to help your own citizens, which quite frankly a lot of states don't really care as much as they should about. But before that,
if giving necessary humanitarian aid increases your inequality, will you do it?
Yes, we will. But, ladies and gentlemen, we think we have to make a very important distinction as to why humanitarian aid and development aid are different. Firstly, we think that these are things that people are obviously going to die without. If those individuals are dead, that's a harm we cannot take back. However, economic inequality in our country is something that, while unfortunate, is something that can be fixed. But the question is, ladies and gentlemen, how do we maximize our particular capacity to fix that vis-a-vis our ability to maintain a certain moral high ground, or at least a certain principle justification? The next thing we're going to talk about is how it changes the particular images of these countries, and why that's something that's important in order to force them to deal with their own issues of inequality. We think that the countries like the United States, or etc. right now, are viewed as being the superheroes of the world. They're viewed as being these large, benevolent entities. Sorry, I already took a point and I have a lot to say. These large, benevolent entities that can do no wrong, or at the very least, entities that are very hard to pressure because not only are they more economically empowered, but they have a certain moral high ground. And we think this moral high ground is something that should not exist at all. The fact that we can give these development aids, the fact that we can say we are helping other individuals, is something that reduces the capacity of the world as a whole, and even individuals in our own country, to pressure us to acknowledge and solve our own profound failures, even if these failures are things that profoundly affect the everyday lives of our citizens, such as, for example, their capacity to enjoy their lives, their capacity to get a job, or etc. We think that particular image of us as a hero, that particular political leverage that we get because we give development aid, is what prevents the world and even ourselves from being able to pressure our own respective states to fix those profound inequalities. It gives them some sort of smokescreen and excuse so that they can forward their own political power, as opposed to channeling those funds into their own people. But lastly, ladies and gentlemen, we want to talk about how in the long run this actually creates more support for development aid as a whole, both internally and both in terms of that particular, and also in terms of that particular state. We think that right now, the knowledge that there is so much inequality in these particular countries, the fact that millions of citizens feel this inequality very concretely every day, is something that reduces the support for political, for development, or even humanitarian aid, because those individuals, those citizens, know that their state's obligation is first and foremost to them. We think this is something that limits the state's capacity to give as much and the best aid as they can, because they have to succumb to political pressure within that particular country. We think that particular pressure, that particular negative influence on our ability to give aid, is something that's going to be fundamentally reduced if individuals in our country can at the very least feel that we are making an effort to reduce that particular inequality. We think that the more we reduce that particular gap, the more willing individuals are going to be to give development aid in the long run. But secondly, we're also going to nuance this back to the idea of political power, and how this is actually going to incentivize states to act even without that particular political pressure from within. We think that because these development aids are used to secure the power of these states within the framework of the world as a whole, we think that power is something that's valuable and something that states are obviously going to want to maintain. Therefore, if they want to maintain their particular political power in the world, they are going to be forced to deal with these particular inequalities, regardless of the political pressure within that particular country. For all of these reasons, we are very proud to be in the semifinals.
Hello. Inasmuch as the inequality in countries like the United States is bad, Prime Minister conveniently disregarded the notion of global inequality. That is a pressing concern that even the first world is faced with, when the level of poverty in those countries is comparatively simply worse off, and something we cannot turn a blind eye to, unlike the stance of the Prime Minister. What will we defend coming from Ateneo's bench? What we will say is that countries, regardless of the level of inequality that exists, whether you're a United States or a Sweden or Norway, you have to some extent the responsibility to provide development aid to other countries that need it. We're not necessarily saying that these countries must devote all their efforts and resources to foreign development aid, because alongside that, you can cater to inequality within your nation as well and strike a balance between the two. But the overarching point is that there is no principal distinction between a state's obligation to people within and outside your territory. I'm going to argue two things. Firstly, why global inequality is simply a graver issue that the world must respond to. Second, I'm going to argue why, to a large extent, a lot of the countries with the capacity to provide aid were complicit in harming the third world in the past or in the present. But first, there are three rebuttals I want to launch to the previous speaker. The first thing she says is that development aid isn't an essential need compared to humanitarian aid. We have two levels of responses. Firstly, we concede that there is a difference. But secondly, we reject the notion that development aid isn't an essential need. Because while humanitarian aid will keep people out of starvation in the meantime, it will never be enough to get people out of that endemic system and cycle of poverty. That shows the already pressing need of development aid and why we should not be able to restrict countries from not giving aid to other countries. Secondly, and this is where we take Ina's POI that was so important, right? Because they said that they're also willing to give humanitarian aid even if it increases inequality in your country. That's already a concession that your responsibility as a state is not purely an obligation to your own citizens. And you also have the responsibility to people outside. Last thing, no thank you. They say that we need to take away this idea that countries like the United States are heroes and have the moral high ground. We don't understand where this argument is heading at. But the implicit analysis in Prime Minister's speech is that these countries that don't get development aid under their model should simply solve their own problems, right? But we think that's simply idealistic, and you have to recognize that a lot of the times they can't, right? They never even proved how without the aid of countries like the United States, development internally can happen within these countries. In my argument, I'm going to be proving why you need that development aid. Prime Minister.
Why should developed countries with such massive inequality shoulder this burden, as opposed to developed countries with less inequality, such as the Scandinavian states?
No, we're saying both of these countries have the responsibility to do that. And we say that even in their worst case or their best case scenario, that these countries really have bad inequality. This is where we have to be comparative. Because we're not saying, and this is the first argument, that countries like the United States, we're not saying their inequality isn't necessarily like something we don't have to respond to, but we have to be comparative as to the kind of poverty and the kind of inequality that exists in different contexts. And what we say is that the type of inequality that happens within countries like the United States, where they have the capacity to provide development aid at the end of the day, is nowhere near the kind of poverty that happens in the third world. For two reasons. Number one, in terms of the sheer number of people that exist in that state of poverty, you cannot compare the millions of people that do need that help in other countries versus the other people, which tend to be minorities in countries like the United States that are in extreme notions of poverty. But secondly, if you look at the type of poverty that exists and the type of suffering that exists, these happen because of things like they starve, they don't have roads to go to hospitals and schools. These are the kinds of problems that no longer necessarily exist to a grave extent in the first world. So what that tells you is that people in other countries simply have less social safety nets. And the inequality in the third world creates more humanitarian concerns, which they also wanted to respond to. That's why these countries need that development aid. They need that infrastructure, those industries that create jobs, no thank you, Jason, and businesses which are already more existent in the first world. The conclusion to this argument is that countries with the capacity to lend already have the responsibility by virtue of their advantage in a world with increasingly collapsing borders where global inequality is also endemic to the way the world functions and even these first world states functions. Second argument, we say that to a large extent, these countries are complicit in harming the third world in the past or in the present. Three levels of analysis. Firstly, if you look at the kinds of connections of development aid that exist right now, a lot of the countries in the first world that give a lot of the countries the first world gives aid to tend to be places that used to be their former colonies, for example, like the United States and the Philippines, the European states, to countries in Africa, because in the past they exploited their resources, crippled their societies, and simply abandoned them after that. That already shows the burden these countries have to reverse those harms. But secondly, talk about the first world imposing extremely harmful policies that only benefit them, like World Trade Organization treaties or even environmental treaties that third world nations cannot sustain and are simply forced into signing. That also shows their burden to give back to these countries. Lastly, we say that even the policies aimed at helping the people within your own country, like European Union providing agricultural aid and subsidy to farmers in their territory, we say also directly harms the first world in the way your subsidies to your own farmers harms the exports of African nations that they completely rely on to develop. That shows that if you simply focus on providing aid to your own people, the development that will happen in third world countries will never accrue. We say, in conclusion to this argument, that because your actions directly contributed to that level of global inequality, it is unjust and offensive to leave them hanging and to simply not help until inequality is solved in your own nation, which is a goal we think probably will never even be achieved. We are extremely proud to say this motion should fall.
From opening government, we're going to concede that maybe to some extent we're going to be leaving some of these developing countries on their own. Maybe to some extent the development in these developing countries are not going to grow as fast now. But we think that based on what Rainey argued, if these developed countries really want to use development aid, really think that this is important, then they are going to be pressured even more to develop within their own state. And in the long run, it's also going to increase the current development aids that are currently flowing right now, ladies and gentlemen, which is why we think it's important for us to pressure these countries to help their own citizens first, because in the end, it's going to be the citizens who are going to allow or disallow for more development aid to happen in the future. There are two questions that I want to answer. The first question that I want to answer is this principally correct? Is this principally correct? There was no response from Leader of Opposition on Rainey's point as to why it's inherently wrong, because it's inherently ironic for a country like the United States, for a country like Brazil or South Africa to help countries that are significantly poorer, like, I don't know, Sudan or all of those other countries, but in the end, they're still facing the same problems, ladies and gentlemen. The second thing that they said was, developed countries, these developed countries are, they said, ladies and gentlemen, that, it's also the fault of these development countries why they're not as developed as before. It's not like we're saying that we're going to leave these developing countries alone forever. Remember, ladies and gentlemen, the condition was whether or not these countries can help their own development aids. And like we said, we've already argued why these countries really want to use this development aids for political means, etc. We just think that it's inherently wrong for them to do this without them being able to back up their own money, ladies and gentlemen. They said that, they're also the cause for these developing countries to proliferate, ladies and gentlemen, because, there are other policies like WTO policies and all of those other things. We think that if this is their problem, then regardless of whether or not there's development aid, these problems will still exist. But second, if they really think that this is a problem, and if countries really want to help, then we think that because countries right now cannot help, they might even be incentivized to change these policies. So even if they won't be able to help by giving development aid, they will at least be able to help by lessening the burden of these developing countries, by lessening and making these policies more developing country friendly. We think, so the conclusion to this question question is this principle incorrect? We think that no, it's not right. And whatever problems that they have in the past, they could fix it when they fix their own problems today, ladies and gentlemen. Yes, Ina.
That's a contradiction, because if your standard is helping your citizens first, why are you okay with giving humanitarian aid at the expense of your citizens?
We already argued. Rainy already made a distinction. Humanitarian aid is important right now because without it right now, they will die. Development aid is not as important as humanitarian aid because as much as how we would want to help people, help with their population boom, or help with their insistent poverty, these are things that people can survive in a few months. And I'm going to argue later why it's also important for the sustainability of these projects. The second thing that I want to answer is this going to help countries develop even more? You know, they said that we already conceded that this is going to lessen the pool of development costs. I mean, but think about it, ladies and gentlemen. It's not like these countries like the United States already have a huge pool of development aid. They're only giving like 0.1% of their GDP versus, for example, Scandinavian countries who give more than 1% of their own GDP. We think that although the need for these poor countries might be greater, this doesn't happen in all cases. That's why we're talking about countries with massive inequality. Countries like Brazil, for example, might have people in the Forbes 100 richest people, but they also have shanties where people can't even eat anything, ladies and gentlemen. Or we're going to concede that maybe some of these countries, some of the poor people in these countries might not be as poor, but we're already willing to take that harm, ladies and gentlemen. The second thing that Rainey talked about was how this is going to create greater support for the public, and why we think this is also important for increasing or sustaining these projects. Because we think that in a sense, this is also the same thing with what is happening in Italy when it comes to their refugees. Because the Italians are not satisfied with how Italy is giving them jobs or is treating them, ladies and gentlemen, they would want to take these refugees out of Lampedusa because these people think that these people are eating up all of our money. When you force the state to help their own people first, what you do is that you also allow the state to have greater support for development aid. So right now, the United States will not only be willing to give 0.1% of their GDP, they might be willing to give more because people are willing to support these development projects even more. The second thing, but other than that, ladies and gentlemen, this is why it's also important. Because it is because development aids are long-term programs like infrastructure that you need for the sustainable popular support of individuals to keep these projects going. What happens, ladies and gentlemen, is that you allow for these projects, for example, like providing condoms or providing infrastructure like hospitals, to stop in the middle of them helping these countries because the state the state is then forced to take these projects out or lessen these projects because the citizens are not willing to support this anymore because the people think that, the state is already abusing us, they're helping other people over us. We think that this is selfish, but that's just how democracy works, and that's how these countries function. They listen to their people first because it is because of their people that they're allowed to do this. If you allow for this to continue, ladies and gentlemen, you cut off these infrastructures, you cut off these development aids, and you leave these countries alone. We think that that is worse. We'd rather maybe postpone the development aids in the future, but at least guarantee that there is sustainable and even greater support. That's why we think that we have to cut down these countries and make sure that they fix their own problems first.
We will not be able to absolutely resolve inequality within states, nor will we be able to fix global inequality. But coming from my speech, I want to show you how fighting global inequality is actually a strategic way to improve the inequality within the donor states, i.e., by reducing the global trend of third world individuals migrating to the first world and increasing their inequality by competing for those resources. This reduces the very rhetoric of BPM, of refugees eating up your resources, precisely because people go to these countries because it is already full of these types of sources in the first place. That's why, even if there are Scandinavian states that are capable of lending, who, mind you, they never even told us have a large incentive to do so right now, this is still necessary for these states with inequality in order to fight their own problem. What I'm going to do is I'm going to present how global inequality is a cause for inequality within donor states, but before that, a few responses. Firstly, what exactly happens to the development aid that would have been given to the third world? Because they didn't really tell us how it was going to work. They just said that people will see automatically that, well, once you've taken away this development aid, that automatically people will be better and will support your policies a lot more, without necessarily telling us how exactly this is going to reduce the inequality on their side. Because we think you can still have the same types of policies, like, for example, increasing taxes or having more redistribution on our side, without having to take the cost of making these individuals in the third world have to suffer. We don't think that was exactly the debate they wanted to engage with. But in the second level, what we'd say is it also reinforces their idea that the US will be the large benevolent entity because it incentivizes more border crossing. Like, for example, if you're not going to give development aid to Mexico for them to develop their own resources, then what incentive will these types of Mexicans have to stay within their own state and not necessarily go to the United States and eat up the resources that you wanted to fight in the first place and increase the inequality that they wanted? Second response. They said what's going to happen is they're going to pressure a lot more, no thank you, these developing states to become more developed. That's nice rhetoric, but the pressure is already felt right now. The question was, how exactly will they achieve this type of pressuring of developing states to actually develop in the first place? Just because they feel the pressure doesn't mean they have the resources or the funds to build infrastructure so that they will develop. So if they were already, that argument in fact concedes the idea that they want these types of states to develop, but not necessarily ever proving how exactly that was going to happen. They said, well, the best thing that's going to happen for these types of developing states is that they will not be left as developing states forever, precisely because these developed states will in the future give to them anyway. The question exactly was, when exactly will these developed states ever help anyway on their side? Because they never really showed at what end will this inequality end for these donor states and automatically shift to these types of developing states. But lastly, coming from the second speaker, she talked to us about, using the same words as her Prime Minister, of how you're creating greater support for the public. The first question we have to ask is, why is it that you always need the support in the first place in order for this development aid to go through? Because you don't necessarily have the same support, for example, for humanitarian aid, or even, for example, for justified wars or what have you. But we still do so precisely because there's a greater moral responsibility that perhaps your individuals may not necessarily understand or may not necessarily believe in. That was the greater responsibility that Miko was already talking to you about, but not necessarily responded to by Deputy Prime Minister. But on the second level that we'd say is that it's not as if you already want to create a more sustainable plan, what you're ultimately doing inside government is, if they're not going to have this development aid, then it's only going to increase the need for more humanitarian aid for these states, which means you're still going to have to continue to reduce the ability for you to work within your own state, precisely because if you are an impoverished country who is not able to develop, you're going to have more humanitarian causes of people not being able to go to schools, not being able to go to hospitals, which means you will always have to consistently give humanitarian aid and ultimately will not have the same type of development for these states anyway. Closing.
Often the target of development aid are countries with rampant economic and corruption problems like sub-Saharan states and some countries like the Philippines. If these countries are so ignorant towards, like for example, ignoring their own aid, how likely are you to stop the attraction to like developed states?
Conditionalities. We think you can still always implement conditionalities for this development aid to still be helpful within the types of corrupt states anyway. We think that's not the debate we're having. Firstly, we think global inequality is actually a cause for inequality within donor states. Because inasmuch as the United States and European nations are full of inequality, many of the third world states do not see it in the same way.
they often think of the American dream or making it big in Europe because of more job opportunities. This is precisely the large benevolent entities that Prime Minister was talking about. This is one of the push factors, for example, that led cases of like OFWs or Africans and Indians migrating to the United States and creating a brain drain within these developing states in the first place. What exactly is the point? Not only is it already bad for these third world states, it is also damaging to the first world. How so? It encourages massive migration to these first world states, and the implication of this is there's a larger competition for resources and job opportunities within these states. What that means is that it makes it less likely for the poor people within these states already to have the very resources they want, and it maximizes that inequality. This is why businesses want to lower wages, since Mexicans or Filipinos are willing to go for that anyway. But even if it doesn't necessarily create that competition for resources, it reinforces the rhetoric of the right wing that these people are leechers and we shouldn't give to them anyway. That's why you have a lot of anti-immigration policies right now in the European Union or in the United States. How exactly then does development aid change this? What exactly do third world states do with this? It's not simply that they keep it for themselves in the form of corruption. What they usually do with it is they either incentivize businesses or perhaps build infrastructure that encourages more investments within these states in the first place. What that does is it improves local businesses in these third world states and perhaps in other states. And if you improve these types of local businesses, the implication is on the first level, you're more likely to reduce the very migration and the massive inequality that's already happening within these donor states. But it's also less likely, for example, for your multinational corporations to just keep outsourcing their businesses within these donors, within these third world countries. Because if these third world countries already have more developed and local businesses, then it's less likely for these multinational corporations to continue going to these other states, and which means it's more likely for them to remain in a donor state and actually improve the businesses within the United States, for example, or within Europe. So we think what it ultimately does is it may help, it will more likely help these third world countries, but it also helps the own first world countries, precisely because it encourages businesses to stay within that state and actually not have to go to the whole drain of other individuals going to fight for those types of jobs or what have you. So we think ultimately what development aid does is it not only helps these third world states, but it also helps these first world states, and for all of these reasons we're proud to oppose.